Horizontal gaze nystagmus is testing your eyes for a particular type of nystagmus. Nystagmus is the involuntary jerking of the eyes. Right now, as you look into any of the eyes for the folks next to you, you'll see that your eyes appear to be steady, okay? But when you drink, it affects first your judgment, then your small muscles, then your large muscle groups. And the smallest of our muscles are the muscles that control our eyes. So when you drink, it affects your small muscle groups, and your eyes lose their ability to not jerk, and you'll be able to see that. And that's the nystagmus that we're talking about. But it's only one kind of nystagmus. So this test is designed to ensure that the officer, if they administer the test correctly, only sees this particular type of nystagmus, okay? Because there are dozens of other types of nystagmus. For example, there's something called rotational nystagmus and post-rotational nystagmus. If you spin a person and you were able to look at their eyes while they're spinning, you will see that same nystagmus, the jerking of the eyes. If you stop them after they've been spinning, you'll see the same jerking of the eyes. If someone is facing traffic and they're actually following traffic, you'll see the jerking of the eyes as opposed to smooth movement. So that's why officers are trained to position the person away from traffic so that they're not looking at traffic or a train that's going by, things that could otherwise cause this jerking of the eyes. So what does the jerking of the eyes look like? If you imagine a windshield wiper going across a wet windshield, that's what the normal movement of your eyes should look like, okay? Now imagine what we've all seen happen when your windshield wipers get turned on when it's not raining outside and it shakes as it goes across your windshield. That's exactly what it looks like when your eyes display nystagmus. So a proper administration of the horizontal gaze nystagmus begins by qualifying the person to take the test. The first thing the officer is supposed to ask is whether or not they've had any recent head injuries, okay? Because head injuries are something that could affect the presence of nystagmus, okay? The officer should also be clued into whether or not there's been a recent accident, right? So whether or not the person says they've had a head injury, if the airbags were just deployed and there's a chance that the person had a head injury, something the officer should keep in mind in determining whether or not this person should take the test. The other thing that the officer is going to do to screen the person to take this test is check for equal pupil size, okay? Because if you have a blown pupil, again, it's going to tell the officer that you're not a good candidate to take this test. They might be seeing something other than horizontal gaze nystagmus or nystagmus, the nystagmus that they're looking for. So the officer is going to hold up a stimulus, typically it's a pen or a pen with a light at the top of it, and they're gonna tell the subject to look at their light while they're asking these preliminary questions. As they're looking at the stimulus, before the officer ever begins to move the stimulus, the officer is also making sure that the person doesn't have what's called resting nystagmus, which a small percentage of people have, the actual visible shaking of the eyes before you even conduct the test. So all those things are happening before the officer actually starts the test. As you review DWI videos, you need to see the officer doing these things, asking these questions, holding the stimulus up 12 to 15 inches away from the face, and seeing whether or not the person has resting nystagmus and has asked these qualifying questions, okay? These are standardized tests, meaning if the officer doesn't do it exactly as prescribed, then the results that they claim to see may or may not be valid, okay? All that's happening before we've even started the test. Then I'm gonna have a volunteer come up. If you were a suspect in a DWI and I was the officer, I would say, I'd like you to look at the tip of my pen, and I would right now be checking for equal pupil size and to make sure that you do not have resting nystagmus, which you do not. Then I would do a preliminary set of passes. So I want you to follow the tip of my pen with your eyes and your eyes only.
All right.
Okay, so I'm going to pause right there to explain what I've just done. I have conducted 2 passes, checking both eyes, and I've checked for equal tracking. Equal tracking means that I'm observing the subject's ability to track the stimulus with their eyes and follow the tip of my pen. Then I'm going to actually conduct the next pass, and of course the officer would not have taken a break here, the break that I've taken to explain. And you're going to continue to follow the tip of my pen with your eyes and your eyes only. Okay, so that second pass, even though it may have looked the same to observers, was checking for lack of smooth pursuit. So this is where I've actually started the test, and there is a prescribed time that it's taking me to get from the tip of your nose to this extent, which is generally going to be the width of your shoulders, and that's 2 seconds out, 2 seconds back, 2 seconds out, 2 seconds back. And that's required. A lot of times you'll see officers do something like this. Okay, and that's not what the manual says, right? It has to be the 2 seconds out, 2 seconds back. And there I'm looking for the lack of smooth pursuit, which is exactly the windshield wiper going over a dry windshield kind of example that I gave, okay?
Okay.
The next part of the test is beginning now. Once again, I'm going to check each eye. This time I'm only going to do 1 pass, but an officer would actually do 2, but for sake of time, do that. Okay, so an officer would repeat what I just did twice. This is a test for distinct and sustained nystagmus at maximum deviation, which is a very fancy way of saying, if I take the stimulus out to maximum deviation, which is 45 degrees if I'm out to your shoulder, then I'm looking for nystagmus, the jerking of the eyes, when I hold it there. And I'm holding the stimulus there for 4 seconds. Okay, once again, that's a prescribed time. So in my mind, I was counting the 1, 2, 3, 4 as I held the stimulus out at maximum deviation, which is what an officer is supposed to do. Once again, you see officers do this test, bring it out here, and 2 seconds later, they're back here. 2 seconds later, they're back in the middle. Okay, but it has to be distinct and sustained, meaning that 4-second count. And the officer is essentially now looking at an eyeball that appears to be just hitting it against something and coming back. That's exactly what it looks like, almost like a bouncing ball. The final pass for horizontal gaze nystagmus is when the officer takes this stimulus, they move it out. Now this time, they're going to move it out until they see the nystagmus begin. And here they're looking for onset prior to maximum deviation or prior to the 45-degree angle. So now we've done a qualification to see if you're a good candidate to take the test. I've asked the qualifying questions. I've checked that you can actually track my stimulus. All of that qualifying you to take the test. And the test itself had 3 parts. The first, lack of smooth pursuit, which is 2 seconds out, 2 seconds back. So as you're reviewing videos and looking at whether an officer administered the test correctly, that's one of the easiest things you can look for, is the time it took for him to take the stimulus out and back on that first pass. You can also look at when he took it to maximum deviation for that second clue, if he actually held it out there for 4 seconds each time. So 4, 4, 4, 4 again. You can also look for the total number of passes, because if they're doing it correctly, they've done all these steps and all these passes, and you can easily count them to see if the officer has administered the horizontal gaze nystagmus test correctly. Of the 3 field sobriety tests, that one is arguably the only scientific one. There's a lot of data that went into and research that went into establishing that if a person fails this test, and failure for this test is 4 out of 6 clues, okay? So if they fail this test, there's an 84% chance based on that test alone that this person is a .08 or greater. Okay, that's how accurate the science is. The problem with this test is most officers administer it incorrectly. That's the first one. Hardest for most jurors to understand, right? If I'm on the side of the road, I'm thinking the officer asked me to follow the stimulus, right? Because never would I tell the subject in the real world what my clues were. I would simply say, follow the tip of my stimulus, right? That's my test. I don't tell them these are the clues I'm looking for. So even when folks call me and say, hey, I've been arrested for a DWI, I think I did pretty good on the field sobriety test, what they're really telling me is, hey, when the officer asked me to follow the stimulus with my eyes, I did. I wasn't weaving or bobbing or stumbling. I stood there the whole time, because that's what they think the test is. That's not what the test is, right? So it's important to understand what the test is. And again, of the 3 field sobriety tests, that one is actually the most accurate, okay? Any questions about horizontal gaze nystagmus? Yes.
How does vertical nystagmus play into the HGN test?
So vertical gaze nystagmus is an additional type of nystagmus that can be checked for. And so the officer will take their stimulus and raise it above the person's head. And if you see vertical gaze nystagmus, it indicates a high level of intoxication for that person, not necessarily period, but for that person, that's a high level of intoxication. It's not necessarily always used, and I don't think it gets talked about in court very much. But yes, if you were an officer and you did vertical gaze nystagmus and the person showed vertical gaze, then they would be highly intoxicated for that person. Okay. Other questions?
So you mentioned that the shoulders are typically the barrier for the HGN test. What's happening if an officer is continually going outside of that range and the subject moves their head to follow the pin?
That's an improper administration of the test because it's supposed to be for it. So we use our shoulders kind of as a guideline, but the real accurate measurement would be a 45-degree angle. So if you start going out here, then it's an improper administration. Folks commonly, particularly if they've been drinking, when they're asked to follow the tip of the pen with their eyes and their eyes only, they always move their head. Very commonly move their head. And so officers all the time have to stop the test and say, using your eyes only, I want you to follow the tip of my pen. So if that happened, 1, the officer's administering it wrong, but 2, the officer should tell the person to get back into that position where they're looking forward and just follow with their eyes. Okay. Other questions?
Why do police not have to have a camera visual on the subject's eye?
So it's interesting. I've had a few boating while intoxicated cases, and on boating while intoxicated cases, they have visor cams, and on those cameras, you can see what the subject's eyes are doing. And I've literally had cases where the report said the warden saw 6 out of 6 clues on horizontal gaze nystagmus. You watch the video, and the person was never following the tip of the pen, period. So it's impossible for him to have seen the clues. I'm not saying bad officers or wardens or anything else, but I'm saying officers tend to put 6 out of 6 on every report that you ever come across, right? I can't think of the last time I saw it 2 out of 6 or 4 out of 6, right? Maybe some 4 out of 6s. But it's generally 6 out of 6, and it's almost a form that they fill out, right? They all think they're doing it right. They all think they're getting the clues, and they put down 6 out of 6. So I would say there hasn't been a push for visor cams, right? If it's kind of a hard subject to understand, right? So to get public outcry about why we don't have videos that track people's eyes, it'd probably just take too much. So right now it's just not something that's captured.